Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Brandon. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a volunteer with Amnesty. We'll just let everyone in the webinar. And we're so glad to be able to bring together, a community of folks with an interest and more so a passion for seeing a better future on the topic we're about to speak about. So to outline a little bit about the evening, as I said earlier, if you want any snacks, a nice button, or to sign Amnesty ceasefire petition, information is just in that room right behind you. And then the bathrooms are just through the kitchen at the back wall. So anytime that you need to do that as well, feel free. And if you want water in the kitchen instead of soda or whatever, you're most welcome. To give you a sense of the outline of the evening, we'll be doing our introduction and land acknowledgement. We'll introduce our excellent speaker that we have lined up for you tonight. And then we will be showing a 15-minute video, sort of as a preface to the conversation. So, the topic tonight is, Voices Unveiled, Unpacking Israel's Apartheid. And those are not using the word apartheid is a very specific choice. And so we want to introduce why Amnesty came to that conclusion as a kind of an introduction, as well as covering a little bit of the history, so we can focus more on the contributions of our speakers without having them to explain the last several decades. So great. I definitely want to start the evening grounded in the values that I see as most important for this conversation. And it might be a bit cliche, but as an Amnesty volunteer, the values that we're coming to the table with are human rights. So our perspective on this starts with the UN Charter, the Declaration on Human Rights, which are for all people, all of the time. So we just hope in the questions that we're gonna, allow everyone to ask, and just the general tenor of the conversation, we want it rooted in human rights. So we know that currently the world is not safe for Palestinians, and we know that the world is also not safe for Jewish people in Israel and elsewhere. But our conversation tonight isn't, one side, the other side, no sides, what have you. There's lots of conversations there that we're going to get into. We're here for human rights for everyone, all of the time. And to continue that to our land acknowledgement, I think it's of the utmost importance that in an event where we're going to speak about one group taking over a piece of territory and going out through the process of colonialism, that we reflect on where we're living right now. So I myself am a settler on unceded, which means never signed away, never negotiated, never really even discussed territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. We are on territory that was taken by one ethnic group from another, and we live in the ramifications of that world. So for me, I'm exceptionally grateful to live here, but I recognize I was not necessarily invited. And I think that for me is a theme that I'm going to take into this conversation. So not just pointing fingers at bad guys, but maybe taking a little bit of stock of who I am and where I exist and how I exist in the world. So yeah, I hope our folks online can hear us. Definitely let us know in the question and answer part if you're having any issues hearing us. But yeah, I'm gonna do just a quick overview of our wonderful panelists, where we'll give them some time to introduce themselves after the video. But we'll start the video and maybe give time for a few more folks to show up at the back. But yes, we have three excellent speakers tonight, and I was so glad when each of their representative groups said that they were interested in speaking with us. So the first one, on the left over here, we have Sarah from the Palestinian Youth Movement. So Sarah has been an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement for 2 years now, and has worked, with other campus groups for, Palestinian causes, awareness, what have you, things like that. We also have from Independent Jewish Voices, we have Claire in the middle here. Claire's an educator, an artist, and an organizer with Independent Jewish Voices, which has a long history of looking at the policies of the Israeli government and maybe saying this doesn't represent, all people of the Jewish faith. And last but certainly not least, we have Ella, who is representing Labor for Palestine. So Ella is one coordinator for Labor for Palestine, the Ottawa chapter, and the vice president of the Algonquin College Faculty Union. The union perspective, labor, I think has a huge say in human rights, so I'm really excited for that perspective as well. But again, we'll let them introduce themselves. I think they can probably speak to their life experience a lot better than I can. But we wanted to start right away with the video to sort of set the tone. So if I can get you to pull that up, that would be excellent. And then how it's going to work is we have a list of questions, but we're also very interested in your questions. So both for folks who are online or right here, we welcome you to, if you have a question at any point, feel free to raise your hand. I'll give a little head nod to you. You can say it. We'll repeat it because our microphones are up here so the online folks can hear it. But we definitely want to get everyone's perspective. And it's so nice that you're here and the online folks as well to ask your questions direct. But if not, we have a bank of questions, so don't feel that you have to come up with something on the spot. So without further ado, thank you so much for coming. It's really nice. Ian and I have been volunteering at Amnesty for a few years, and 3 years ago it was about 4 of us, social distancing in a park trying to figure it out. And now we're all here together as civil society to have a really important conversation. So it just warms my heart that you're all here. But yeah, Ian, I'll ask you to start the video if that's all right.
When you hear the word apartheid, what do you think of? Probably the disturbing images of racial segregation between whites and blacks in South Africa, where a regime ruled by a racist white minority declared themselves officially superior to the black majority, then proceeded to dominate them. South Africa's apartheid system officially ended in the mid-1990s, but that doesn't mean apartheid can't happen elsewhere. Here, in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, Palestinians are being forced off their land and out of their homes, separated and segregated by laws, walls, and checkpoints. They live in a constant state of fear and insecurity, and deliberately impoverished. While, on the other hand, Israeli authorities have given the Jewish Israeli population privilege over Palestinians in just about every facet of life. The question is, does this all amount to the crime of apartheid? First, the definition of apartheid. The crime against humanity of apartheid is perpetrated when particular serious human rights violations are committed with the purpose of establishing and maintaining a system of domination by one racial group over another and systematically oppressing them. But does this system exist in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories?
And there's been a growing debate about whether the situation in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories is apartheid. And now is the time for us, as the world's largest human rights organization, to offer up our analysis. Our findings and criticism are directed not at the Jewish people, but at the Israeli state. It's the Israeli state that put in place the policies that implement the laws and the practices that oppress Palestinians.
Well, Israeli leaders have been clear about their intentions from the beginning. In 1948, just before he became the first Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion visited Lifta and other Palestinian areas near Jerusalem that were completely emptied of Palestinian residents following attacks by Jewish forces. He stated, "There are no Arabs, 100% Jews. If we persist, it is quite possible that in the next 6 or 8 months there will be considerable changes in the country, very considerable, and to our advantage." More than 70 years later, then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu posted on Instagram that Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people and only them. So, it's no surprise that Israel built a system of racially discriminatory laws, policies, and practices that privilege only Jewish people. And Palestinians, well, Palestinians live there too. They were there before Israel was established. But, as we will explain, they've been trapped for decades in a system that treats them as a lesser, non-Jewish racial group. Before Israel was established in 1948, Palestinians comprised most of the population, around 70%, and owned the vast majority of private land, about 90%, in what was British Mandate Palestine. Jews, many of whom had emigrated from Europe, comprised around 30% of the population, and they and Jewish institutions owned about 6.5% of the land.
The port of Haifa in Palestine lies shattered by bombs and strewn with dead.
In the course of establishing Israel as a Jewish state in 1948, Israeli authorities acted to turn the situation on its head and were responsible for the mass expulsion of Palestinians and the destruction of hundreds of villages, forcing around 800,000 Palestinians out of their homes and lands. Thousands of Palestinians and Jews were killed in the context of attacks on civilians during this conflict. Today there are around 6 million Palestinian refugees who Israel denies the right to return to their homes. After the 1967 war, Israel occupied the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Israel's brutal military rule, coupled with the establishment and expansion of illegal Jewish settlements, has coerced Palestinians into enclaves, creating further fragmentation and segregation. The objective? Maintain Jewish-Israeli hegemony and maximize control of land. In the city of Jerusalem, the Israeli official policy is to maintain at least a 60% Jewish majority.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
So where do all the Palestinians live now? 3.4 million live outside of Israel in the occupied territories, mainly in refugee camps in neighbouring countries. 2.5 million Palestinians live in Israel and East Jerusalem, restricted to enclaves that make up around 3% of the entire area. 3 million Palestinians live in the occupied West Bank, but are only allowed to access 40% of the land to live and work. The rest of the area is for the Jewish Israeli settlers only. 2 million are trapped in the Gaza Strip, one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Fragmentation of the Palestinian society and the dispossession of their lands are key pillars of Israel's apartheid system to maintain domination and control. But there's more. The unequal structure of nationality and status, restrictions on freedom of movement, use of military rule, denial of right to political participation or the right to peaceful protest, and cruel separation of families all add to the complex system that we see today.
The world in general hasn't woken up to the fact that there is an entrenched system of oppression against Palestinians across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, wherever they may live, by the Israeli state. It's a system that's been put in place and maintained for decades, and it's that system that is the root cause of so many of the violations, the misery and the suffering that millions of Palestinians face on a daily basis.
One way to understand this segregation and oppression is to look at the ID system. Jewish Israelis have only one ID card, with a status that grants them the right to live almost anywhere they wish in the country. They can move freely with access to healthcare and vast resources. Palestinians, on the other hand, have 4 types of ID cards, if any at all. The kind of ID card you are given determines the level of rights you can enjoy and controls where you can go and what you can do. If you hold a green card, you are subject to military rule. And if you have a green card with a Gaza address, it means you're trapped in a 365-kilometre square open-air prison under Israeli military blockade in place since 2007. Israel controls what goes in and what goes out, from children's toys to medical supplies. 90% of the people have no access to safe drinking water, 47% are unemployed, 56% live in poverty. Palestinians with a Gaza ID are forbidden from going to Jerusalem in the West Bank, even if they have family there. Some people in the West Bank are considered to live there illegally and can be deported immediately to Gaza if found by the army, even if they have been in the West Bank for decades. Whereas, if you hold a green card which has a West Bank address, then you live here. This green card means you can live within specific enclaves surrounded by illegal Israeli settlements. And there's a separation wall and fences built around you since 2002, which Palestinians call the Apartheid Wall. It's 8 meters high in places and 700 kilometers long. That's twice the height of the Berlin Wall and more than 4 times its length. 80% of it is built inside the West Bank, occupying even more Palestinian land. There are separate roads for Israelis and Palestinians, hundreds of checkpoints scattered throughout, not to mention the 54 years of occupation which has devastated the lives of millions of Palestinians. Palestinians with a West Bank ID can travel to Gaza or East Jerusalem, but only if they receive a permit from the military to do so. This blue ID is for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. They can travel to the occupied West Bank as well as to Israel, but they are not citizens of Israel. They have only been granted a residency status. This means that they cannot vote in Israeli national elections, and if they leave East Jerusalem for too long, for example to study or work abroad or in other parts of the occupied West Bank, their residency is revoked, so they can't return. Since 1967, Israel has revoked the residency status of more than 14,600 Palestinians from East Jerusalem. Finally, Palestinian citizens of Israel. They have been through it all. They are the group that remained in Israel despite the ethnic cleansing in 1948. They lived under Israeli military rule that applied only to them and not Jewish Israelis for 18 years between 1948 and 1966. They were made citizens but can never become nationals and enjoy equality unless they become Jewish, which the law prohibits. They are the only Palestinians who can run and vote in Israeli elections, and they can move relatively freely, but the inequality against them was never dismantled, and they face daily institutional discrimination, including as members of parliament. And if this complex ID system wasn't enough to segregate the Palestinian community, in 2002 Israel introduced a law that prohibits family unification. That's right, denying Palestinians the right to live with their loved ones if their ID cards are different. And this woman is one of thousands of Palestinians who Israel will not issue any ID card. She can't travel, can't hug her family, only see them meters away across the border. Putting down roots, the family home, these are crucial parts of what make a strong community. To make sure Palestinian communities can't develop any further, Israel has made it almost impossible to grant building permits for Palestinian homes. So, Palestinians live in a catch-22 situation. In order to have shelter or develop their communities, they must build without a permit. And if they do so, Israel can demolish the structures on the basis that it was built without a permit. Right now, there are over 150,000 Palestinians currently living under the constant threat of demolition and forced eviction, many of them for the second or third time. In the West Bank, an average of 18 Palestinian structures were demolished every week in 2020. The same year, Israel issued 1,094 building permits for Jewish applicants, and only 1 for Palestinian. This goes back to the heart of the issue. To maintain the state's character as Jewish, Israel systematically disadvantages Palestinians while privileging Jewish Israelis. This racist privilege has been enshrined in laws, policies and practices, and it enables Palestinian resources to be taken in order to economically benefit Jewish Israeli citizens.
The system of apartheid is the Israeli state's oppression and domination of Palestinians on a daily basis. It's the laws, the policies and the practices that it puts in place and then implements to control Palestinians' daily lives. And then there are the crimes of apartheid. The crimes of apartheid are those acts, those violations, those patterns of violations that Israel is committing to create and then maintain that system of apartheid.
Amnesty International and other rights organisations have been documenting patterns of human rights violations and international crimes for decades. These are the most visible and violent part of this system. At the end of May 2020, 4,236 Palestinians were held in Israeli prisons, and 352, including 2 children, were held without charge or trial. Between September 2000 and February 2017, Israeli forces killed 4,868 Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories, including 1,793 children, outside the context of armed conflict. And Amnesty International is not aware of any case in which an Israeli soldier has been convicted of willfully causing the death of a Palestinian in the occupied territories since 1987. This imbalance of rights, justice and accountability is never more clear than when a Jewish Israeli life appears to have more value than a Palestinian's. Israel's apartheid and its cruel and prolonged strategies deliberately disadvantage Palestinians wherever they live. They cannot claim and enjoy equality with Jewish Israelis.
Look, everyone can make a difference. Together, we need to speak out on behalf of Palestinians. We need to speak about the human rights violations that they are suffering. We need to talk about the apartheid, the system of apartheid to which they are subjected. Because by campaigning together, putting pressure on the Israeli state, we can have this system of apartheid dismantled. Join us, join our campaign. Everyone has the power to make a difference.
Wonderful. Thanks everyone for taking a minute to watch the video. While Ian gets it set up, and Justin, if you grab the lights for us, it'd be excellent. So yeah, this video is based on roughly a decade of research that Amnesty has done. And if you'd like to learn more about the specific Amnesty perspective, there's a 300-page report that painstakingly outlines why the organization came to the conclusion of apartheid. And there's also a 90-minute course that you can take, which gets really into the weeds of why we did it and kind of the main factors of that consideration. But now,
could there be a link to that video sent out?
sure, yeah, absolutely.
Because I like its title and I'd like to be able to hand it on to others.
We appreciate that, it's great. But yeah, the reason we're all here tonight is not necessarily just Amnesty's perspective, but we've invited some community leaders to talk about their perspective. And so for the group, I would just ask that you introduce yourselves, your organization, and maybe what's top of mind for each of you, and then we'll get into the question and answer period. But yeah, over to the panel.
Right. Sure. Okay, hi everyone. As was mentioned, my name is Sara. I'm an organizer with the Palestinian Youth Movement. I've been organizing for several years now with PYM for 2 years, but prior to that with other Palestinian community organizations and also on campus with student groups. So a little bit about the PYM. We are a political organization comprised of Palestinian and Arab youth fighting for liberation of our homelands from Zionism and US imperialism. And so we organize across Canada, the United States, and in Europe. We have 14 different chapters across those countries. And we've been mobilizing our community we've been mobilizing our base and our community for 10 plus years. We're primarily a base building organization, so we work to build power within our communities and build a strong base in order to gain power within our communities and influence the politics and also the perspectives of the countries that we live in as well, particularly being youth in the diaspora. And at the heart of our project is our refusal to allow the conditions that violently uprooted us from our homelands to continue to sever our ties from our national liberation struggle. So we see ourselves as Palestinian and Arab youth in the diaspora as having a responsibility within the broader Palestinian national liberation struggle. And so we take up that responsibility through organizing, and we do that through several different means. So we organize protests, we disseminate political education within our communities, we do cultural programming as well to bring our communities together and also find ways to maintain our culture, and also it's a form of political education as well. And we also very much emphasize the importance of resistance arts. So we, for example, the Palestinian Youth Movement has an annual scholarship, the Ghassan Kanafani Scholarship, scholarship after the martyr Ghassan Kanafani, who was a Palestinian poet and author. And so we give a scholarship to students who excel in resistance arts, and we also publish an anthology every year that highlights a bunch of resistance arts that Palestinians in the diaspora have developed for the national liberation struggle. So that's a little bit about PYM, and I'll hand it over to Claire.
Deeply apologize for coughing during your remarks. Some water went down the wrong way. My name is Claire Hertig. I am a member of Independent Jewish Voices Ottawa chapter. Yeah, I'll just describe very briefly the work of IJV, and excited to get into the actual conversation, because I think that's what we're all here for, and that's what we're in the most from. So IJV is a grassroots organization. You've probably heard of it, chapters across Canada. And basically we exist to amplify the voices of Canadian Jews who want to speak up for human rights, international, and the respect of international law and justice in Palestine. Independent Jewish Voices was the first national Jewish organization to endorse the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS, against Israeli apartheid in 2005. And that's very much where IJV anchors its solidarity orientations on what Palestinians in Palestine and in the diaspora are asking for, because obviously solidarity movements must be led by the people who are directly impacted. And so we take our cue from movements like the BDS movement, but as well from our comrades locally who are leading this movement for Palestinian liberation. We're also founded in concepts of anti-racism and Indigenous solidarity. And so, as Brandon mentioned, talking about how we're on stolen land here. So we are both standing up, or doing our best to stand up for the rights of Indigenous people, both on the land that we are as settlers on, as well as making the connection that this is also a colonial situation in Palestine. Sarah mentioned the concept of responsibility. And so someone like myself, I see it as my responsibility as a Jewish person, as an anti-Zionist Jewish person, that I have to speak up. It's not an option to stay quiet when I see these things happening in my name, such as the genocide and apartheid and occupation. And I am not alone. There's many Jews who feel the same as me, and you may or may not have noticed that there's increasingly numbers of Jewish people who are standing up against the use of our identities to defend atrocities and violations of human rights. In terms of what's top of mind for IJV Ottawa, mobilizing Jews and allies in Ottawa to join this movement and to stand up both against genocide, but also the Canadian complicity in genocide. We've seen our government and our media and many institutions society refusing to actually stand for justice and be coherent, especially after we just have had these huge movements for recognizing Truth and Reconciliation and Orange Shirt Day. And so we see the hypocrisy there. Also, education and building community is something that we are hoping to start doing more. IJV Ottawa was not super active in the past few years, but we have revived lately. And so hopefully we'll be able to be more active and inviting folks into conversations similar to this one. And as well, partnering with groups like PYM, like Labor for Palestine, particularly in this moment, we're confronting an unprecedented level of repression against our movements for justice. I've been organizing in solidarity for Palestinian human rights for several years, and I've never seen things at this extent. I'm not sure if my comrades would agree, but that's the feeling that I am experiencing. And so, yeah, just building these links of solidarity in Ottawa, but also, members of IJV are trying to do this across Turtle Island or Canada as well. So I will leave it at that and pass it to Allah.
Thank you, Claire. So I'm Ala Qadi. I was born in the unceded and unsurrendered land of Palestine. I grew up there. I experienced the first Intifada, part of the second Intifada. My family are still on the West Bank, so I had the experience myself experiencing apartheid firsthand. My family are still experiencing apartheid. I am a Palestinian Canadian, and unfortunately, I'm here on Turtle Island, the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe and the Algonquin people. So I've been involved in organizing and working against the colonization and occupation of Palestine back in Palestine and for a bit in the US and here right now. I am part of Labor for Palestine. So Labor for Palestine is a network of unionized workers across Canada. We have different chapters and different organizations. Why unions? Because unions have power. In the collective, in solidarity, we have power. Individually, we are weak. Unions have funds, have power, have access to members. And many unions have in their constitution right now, and has been updated, I'll speak from my larger union, OPSU, there are parts there that state that everyone, including the steward, must work to denounce, to work to stop racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and all form of racism. One of the main ways that we can affect the conflict is by using BDS and by also changing the narrative, getting people educational. We can do that through unions. The situation in Palestine is very similar to what happened in South Africa. You know, we know that the apartheid system has fallen down, and one big part of that was the sanctions in South Africa. The sanctions did not just start by governments themselves. They started by unions and unions organizations, including here in this country. There was a sanctions and a boycott movement in the 80s against South Africa. The governments followed the unions. So we have to take action there. So we work within unions. We also organize educationals. This is like a whole presentation yesterday. I was given an educational to OPSU. Cape had a nice webinar and educational with the High Commissioner of South Africa. So any organization, unionized organization that would like to have an educational, we do that. We participate in trying to put pressure on elected members of the provincial government, of the federal government, of city councillors, etc. And we have seen, of course, the response from unions varies, from very supportive unions such PASC and QB, and ones that were, wishy-washy. But things are changing, and most of young people are actually pro-Palestine. So the way I see it, our work, the lay down work that we put here is not just for now, it's for 20 years down the future. And lots of the liberation movement in Palestine had started with unions, worker unions, student unions, etc. And the unions in Palestine have reached out to other unions elsewhere to help them with the boycott and divestment issue. So I'll speak a little bit about that. I'm also happy to speak about my personal experience with apartheid and firsthand stories from Nakba, from my family, from my mom, my dad, and my grandfather. Thank you. Thanks, Brandon.
Wonderful. So I think, at least I was thinking, I can't speak on behalf of the audience, but it's quite a slate of speakers we have here. So very grateful for you all. For both folks online and in person, if you have questions for online, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll do my best to ask the panelists so everyone can hear. And same in here, if you could just maybe raise your hand, make eye contact, and then I'll give you a point to go ahead. But if nothing comes to mind, we do have a full list that some of our volunteers put together. So we have enough to get us through the whole session, but want to make sure everyone has an opportunity. Perhaps to start, this is an enormous conversation. There's a lot of different ways to approach it. But to start us off, could the panelists, and again, all questions will be for all of you, and we'll kind of let you self-moderate. If someone has a specific question, we'll just please highlight. But otherwise, to the panelists, could you speak to the personal experience of apartheid? So from your individual, from a family point of view, from a community point of view, what does it feel like? So maybe less on the legal side or the political side, but more on the personal, the community side. That would be most appreciated.
I can speak a little to that, if you allow me, as I had my personal experience in my family's experience. And, people look at the Palestinian cause and sometimes they might say, well, this might started in October or started in 2007, 1967, 1948, 1947. No, it hasn't started much earlier. While the first Zionist organization conference started in 1896 in Basel, Switzerland, everything really started from the Balfour Declaration, November 2nd, 1917, where the Lord Balfour, the foreign minister of the UK, or Great Britain at the time, promised Lord Rothschild that Palestine will be a homeland for Jewish people, quote unquote, without affecting the rights for the indigenous people there, which are there. So I'm going to start from there because that's where the actual apartheid and colonization started from 1917 until now. My great-grandfather was actually sentenced to execution around 1920 by the British, but somehow he was commuted and he ended up with life in prison. My mom and my dad were both, I am a son of Nakba survivors. So were living in Palestine, but inside the ethno-racial colonial Zionist project that is called Israel right now. Specifically, my mom was in the city of Bisan. Right now, the name has changed to a Hebrew name, Beit Shan. My father was in Haifa. I had some uncles there. And first, taking stories from my grandma and my mom and my dad, something that the video did not approach, that there was massive discrimination between the privileged Zionist immigrants who came mainly from Central and Eastern Europe and the Palestinian Arab population. The Jewish population prior to 1917 did not exceed more than around 3 to 4%, who lived peacefully with all the other religions that were there. Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Arab Muslims, Palestinian Arab Christians, Palestinian Jews, and Palestinian Jewish people at the time. They all lived peacefully until that immigration. As a story I know from my mom and dad, during the time between 1917 to 1948, when the declaration of Israel, which we call the Nakba, under the British mandate, if you are an Arab citizen and you carried a weapon at this, and in terms of a weapon, if you had as much as a large knife, your punishment was execution. If you were one of the new Zionist immigrants, you were allowed to have a machine gun. At the same time, the British mandate has helped training the Haganah or Gon, Stern, Lehi, and all those organizations, all the Zionist militia that helped create the Nakba at that time. My mom was 11 years old in the city of Bisan, north of the West Bank. We had our family. My grandfather was living in my village, Awarta, which I'll come to that in the West Bank, but she was living with her brothers in Bisan because she went there for school. She would say during that time, the Haganah and Stern will, the Ergon will surround Bisan at night between 1947, 1948. They will go to houses, they will kill a few people, and they will, on purpose, make sure that some of the bodies are in the streets to scare people to leave. The British mandate helped them. When Bisan fell under siege, they left, and in the beginning, they only allowed women and children to leave. My uncle, my late uncle Hassan Kasrawi, who ended up living in the UK and passing away there, had to be dressed as a woman at that time, as a girl, to be able to leave. Her brothers, my mom's brother, stayed, but they escaped through the car through a miracle. They went through a Zionist checkpoint. My father was in Haifa, and at the time, my grandfather sent my grandma and my father and to his brothers to the West Bank to be safe. When the Zionist attacks intensified, my grandfather left on foot Haifa, heading to the West Bank because they had been expelled from Haifa with a few people. They were all taken. They were caught by the Haganah. They were taken to a line of execution. The only reason that my grandfather survived that execution is my grandfather used to work in a gas station, a petrol company. One of his co-workers was a new Zionist immigrant who ended up joining the Haganah. Is that Haganah soldier, militant, could not get it in himself to kill my grandfather. Everyone else was killed, so he just let my grandfather escape. My uncle and aunt, Sharif Kasrawi and Hannah Kasrawi, they left their house in Haifa thinking that they're going to go back. They left the tomatoes on the balcony, and they, like everyone, they thought they're going to come back in 2 to 3 years. They left by boat to Syria, where they passed away in the early 2000s with what's called a refugee document. They were never, ever, not just allowed to leave Palestine, they were never, ever allowed to leave Syria. So that's, let's just take ahead and go. What I'm going to do is I'll speak a little bit about my village and what's happening there. So the video showed you that the West Bank is right now is divided into a set of islands. These islands are currently 248 separated islands where you have checkpoints. Whenever you got to go through this checkpoint, you got to be stopped. And even at the times of peace, I went a few times, and if you're not stopped, if you go too fast, the Israeli army and the snipers could shoot at you. If you go too slow, they might think that you're doing something, and they will shoot at you. My mom and dad live in our village of Awarta, which is a village that have been there for thousands of years, about 10 kilometers from the city of Nablus, where my siblings live. They barely, since October, are able to go. Even prior to that, my 87-year-old mom, which is 11 years older than the state of Israel, wherever my siblings leave, I have to go to the checkpoint. She stays by the phone to check what's going on there. So what I want to do actually is I want to show you my village. I want to show you what happened near the area of Nablus. I want to show you a little bit what the settlers are doing and stuff that happened in September. I think I'm going to share my screen. Give me a moment. Let me know if you can see it. You can see it. All right. So this is the north of the West Bank. This is my village, Awarta. Awarta has been there for at least thousands of years. We have old buildings here. Let's just zoom in and I'll give you an idea about what goes on. Okay, this is the city of Nablus. Nablus is the major city in the northern of the West Bank, where there is about 200 to 250,000 Palestinians and 3 refugee camps, Balata, Askara, Beit Ilma. In Nablus, there's always 3 religions that lived in harmony: Islam, Christians, and Sumerians, who are, a different form, closer to Judaism, but they live further. Let's take a look here. Let's take a look at the settlements here. This is Har Bracha. This is a settlement that was established in the early 80s. This is Ilon Moreh. This is a settlement that was also established in the early 80s. Now, this is let's go a little bit here. But if there is the, sometimes it doesn't show. The settlement of Yitzhahar is close by in this area, established at that time. And here, this is my village. I've been there for thousands of years. This is Itamar. Itamar is a settlement that was established in 1984, and I called very clearly because I recall when they first started building the caravans. I'm going to start to switch to a layer. Okay. Now, what I want to draw your attention to first is this is Awarta, this is Beit Furik, this is Beita, Hawara, Yitzhahar. This is a settlement. This is an Israeli military base. Doesn't even show on the Google Maps. I want to speak about the town of Hawara. The town of Hawara has been targeted by Israeli settlers for the past couple of years. Whenever they saw a Palestinian flag, it is too many settlers go there. In February of 2022, settlers have burned 400 cars and they killed a few people. October 6th, they killed a couple of people. Now, there is a massive Israeli checkpoint here. And I'm going to go, and there's another one here, so you have to go there. Right now, since October, this whole road, which Palestinians have been harassed all the time, there's different roads for settlers, is closed. The whole road going from Jerusalem Ramallah, everything is closed. So everyone actually has to go through either the mountains or through a crabby road through my village, Hawarta. I'll show you a few things. Now, this is Itamar, 500 people, 8,000 people in Hawarta, about over 10,000 in Beit Furi. This is all land of olive trees. All of this, and we have land, this has been confiscated by Israel. We can't access it. My family lost 1/3 of our olive crops. These people here, north of the road, are always threatened by being evacuated. This road between Aqraba and Hawarta goes there is also closed. Now, I want to go here to the town of Beita. So this is the town of Beita. For years, the past 2-3 years, this is Jabal Subeh here in this area, and settlers have made an outpost there trying to get that. The people of Beita have fought, and there's been a few people who have been murdered by Israel. Right now, there's a checkpoint. Let me just show you a few more pictures in terms of, so you can spend 4-6 hours on the checkpoint now, and you risk a few other things. I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, not this one here, slideshow. So this is pictures of my village, Hawarta. You see the extremely old houses here. And okay, this is the checkpoint near my town in 1936. These are British soldiers, and we're suffering the same sort of apartheid that has been going on for 106 years. I mean, take off, there was 27 years under the Jordanian rule. 2022. 2023. So this line of cars that extends 4 kilometers, it goes all the way to our house. Of course, right now at a checkpoint in the West Bank, if your phone has even as much as a picture from Gaza, you could be beaten up, arrested, and go there. To give you an example, my father needed surgery, and they had to go 2 days ahead of time for 10 kilometers in Nablus to be there. Okay. Now, right now, what you see here on the left, this is a standoff with settlers and Israeli soldiers for the olive trees. This wasn't 2 or 3 years ago. This is the 14th of December, 2023. Of course, all the news are on Gaza, but this is happening there. This is unprecedented. What you see are Israeli soldiers protected by the Israeli army stealing our olive crops. Those olive trees are not just older than the state of Israel. They are older than the British mandate. We actually call them Roman trees because the bark is so large. And you can see the difference here. The settlers have their different roads. This is a yellow license plate because we have white license plates. They have yellow license plate. There's Israeli military car in our fields. Destruction of our farmland for the village of Hawarta and Beit Furik. And this was just December. This is last December where everything is going on in Gaza. That's just but a glance. Like from my experience, you feel you're always treated like a second-class citizen, not even a citizen. What we say even in Palestine, like a stray dog walking right now in the West Bank or everywhere has better rights than a Palestinian citizen. I mean, I can go on more, but I want to have time for other questions.
I guess like for my personal experience, it's very different. I've never been to Palestine. Our family story is more of a story of exile. My grandfather was ethnically cleansed from his village in Palestine in 1948 and became refugeed in Lebanon. And so our family has been refugees in Lebanon. Our family to this day remains stateless refugees. And so that means they have no access to any form of citizenship, which is a way for many people to access their basic human rights. And so that essentially means restriction on movement, restriction on land ownership, house ownership, restrictions on ever being stable in a single country, because at any point you could be removed. You are not a citizen of that country. And yeah, essentially a lot of our family members grew up in refugee camps their entire lives. In Lebanon, they faced their own forms of discrimination by the Lebanese government as well for being Palestinian. And I feel like that covered the intricacies of the discrimination through the apartheid system pretty well, so I won't touch on this question for too long.
I'm just gonna show one more thing, actually, I wrote it, which is pretty good, just gives you an idea. This is my Canadian passport. This is where I can travel most of the world freely. It says what I need to use to travel to where I was born. And if I lose this, so this is, they spoke about the ID system. So I have a green ID from the West Bank. I am not allowed to go to Gaza. I'm not allowed to go in with my Canadian passport. And this crappy piece of paper is called an exit permit by the Israeli authorities. It's written in Arabic and in Hebrew in it. Without it, if I lose this, I can't go back. Plus temporary Jordanian passport, one other papers, and things have to go through checkpoints. That's only to get to Jericho. So I thought I'd just give you something. And as mentioned, no Israeli settler has to stop at any checkpoint. There is no, one question that I had when I was making a presentation is, well, there's no apartheid there. So my answer, one of the answers is, show me one Israeli citizen who has to stop at a checkpoint. Show me one Israeli citizen who has to go to any sort of Palestinian authority, anything to get an exit permit. I was just talking to my brother a few hours ahead of now. He's saying that Israel is looking to insert an exit permit to go from one of those islands to another island.
I actually will add to mine as well, like just to say that also Palestinians in the refugee camps are faced with discrimination by the global system that we live in. So like we recently saw the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians funding being pulled from the UN Refugee Agency that is critical for the survival of Palestinian refugees. And that is at the whim of like global imperialist powers. They just decide like, okay, we pull our funding. Beyond that, like when we look at, for example, the post-Oslo Accords period, prior to the Oslo Accords, with Palestinians within refugee camps, they had their own systems of education, they had their own systems of healthcare, like they had developed their own systems in which they provided the needs that they required to the refugees under the umbrella of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Oslo actually resulted in the fragmentation of this system, and as a result, everything was done through UNRWA, which is still a very critical organization, but that also meant that a lot of Palestinian resistance history, a lot of Palestinian history of our most popular resistance fighters, of the way that we struggled against colonialism was completely stripped from the education curriculums, was completely stripped from the cultural programmings, was completely stripped from the way that we teach one another within the refugee camps as well. So that's also another form of discrimination that Palestinians face even within the refugee camps because of the global system that refuses to allow Palestinians to be proud of their resistance history and refuses to allow Palestinians to be proud of their resistance.
I'll just add a little bit on the end here. Obviously, as a white Canadian Jewish person, I experienced what you could say is the flip side of Israeli apartheid. I have no connection to Israel. I don't know anyone who lives there. I'm just one Jewish person, right? And just like every community, we're diverse, right? And we have a different experience. So I'm speaking to my experience, but essentially, I did not grow up Zionist, and I don't have any connection to the land of Israel. And essentially, I can very freely go there, right? I can apply for the trip called Birthright Israel simply because I am Jewish and go and live there. I could go and join the Israeli army if I wanted to. While, my friend Sarah has never been to her homeland. Allah must carry all of these documents simply to visit his family and move freely. And so this is essentially a clear, at least clear for me, and hopefully for many people in the world, right? This clear racial segregation, which is the essence of apartheid. Apartheid being an Afrikaner word or Afrikaans word, sorry, I don't have all my vocab back in my brain right now, for separation, right? And so essentially based on race, we have very different experiences. And the fact that I'm completely divorced from this land, I am not indigenous to this land, but I can go and make my claim on it. I think that is a pretty good summary of apartheid, as well as colonialism and imperialism, as my comrades have mentioned. And so essentially that is from which the impetus comes to fight against this and to dismantle it and to join with as many people as we can in order to get rid of this deeply racist and white supremacist system in Palestine.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the depth and the vulnerability to share, personal stories like that. That means a lot. Sure, yeah.
I'm going to thank the panelists, and I have a question for you guys. How are the groups that you guys are representing, how are they working towards or demanding that the Canadian government do with Israel at least what they did with Russia, in terms of sanctions and things like that? What kind of work has been done to practically, like education is amazing, this is a great session, this is wonderful, but practically speaking, what have the three organizations been able to do?
So just to echo for folks online that didn't hear, the question was looking at what our panelist organizations are encouraging the Canadian government to do, and looking, to the obvious different policies when it comes to Israel versus other countries that may be doing, similar violations of international law. To the panelists.
I mean, I'll say a couple of things in terms of labor. I said unions actually have power. So something very recent, there are 6 of the largest unions in Canada, PASC, NUBG, QB, CUPW, and a couple of others have signed an open letter and sent it to the Prime Minister to restore the funding to UNRWA. There has been also other letters sent to MPs and to the government in the names of some of the large unions to do that. So we've tried to pressure the government through letters, but through lobbying, and sometimes try to hold certain MPs who had our support, and they came short that we can't do that. I mean, I can give an example of an Ontario NDP in Ottawa West, Nepean, Chandrapasma, where our specific union decided not to support that candidate anymore, and a few others. Also, unions, while not related to the government, I said some unions have made some considerable donations to some of the Palestinian organization that does that. I can mention PASC, which donated about $50,000. Our local Algonquin College donated $2,000, and we're doing that. So apart from demonstration, apart from other things, we're trying to use the collective powers of the unions there. And the other thing is the PDS is trying to push for the PDS, because we have unions in some organizations that we might be able to stop or put pressure on those companies not to cooperate with Israel. So I'll probably let it for my colleagues to say something.
Yeah. So essentially, IJV's focus, as I mentioned, it's rooted in the BDS call, right? And so that is essentially harnessing the power of regular people, including workers and union members, but also just regular everyday folks, to work together to put pressure on institutions, on government, on elected officials, on companies and corporations, to boycott, to divest from, and to sanction Israeli apartheid. And so the fact that the chapter in Ottawa right now is in a sort of like rebuilding of itself, we haven't been able to take as many concrete actions yet, but it is, we hope that down the line we'll be able to participate in different actions such as flyering and picketing at businesses where there are Israeli products, and specifically the ones on the targeted boycott list. Also, IJV and members have been part of letter writing and pressure campaigns to our elected officials for ceasefire, but also the larger, broader calls for the dismantling of occupation and apartheid. I know you mentioned education as like perhaps a side thing, but I actually really do think that that's a big piece of all of this fight against apartheid and putting pressure is the more people who know, the more we have who can say when their elected official comes to them, for their vote or in any conversation, people have the knowledge then to speak to this issue and say, as a Canadian or as a whatever constituent, I don't want to be part of this. Unfortunately, the unfortunate truth due to white supremacy is that if I say as a Jewish constituent, this is important to me, they will probably listen to me a little bit more, unfortunately. And so that is the reality of kind of leveraging that kind of privilege to ultimately fight for justice. Also, doing like stickering campaigns on products in stores, that is a way of putting pressure, but it's also an education thing because somebody comes to that shelf and says, oh, I didn't know that. And they might go to the QR code and click on it and learn more. So every conversation that happens about this issue is actually contributing to that larger movement. And we've seen that people have been able to, we all probably in this room have contributed to the fact that Canada did have to call for a ceasefire. And Canada and politicians are facing increasing pressure to, own what they've been doing, that they have been supporting these military exports to the tune of almost $30 million since October, right? So there's also a campaign you can find on the IJV Canada website. It's called Together Against Apartheid. And there's resources and ways to get involved as well. And can't forget marching behind and next to our comrades every week and sometimes more to be there in the streets and show that, no, you can't keep going business as usual. That's not acceptable. We see what's happening. So those are just some things that came to mind. And I hope that was a good answer.
Yeah, I guess for PYM, so we take a very anti-imperialist perspective to the Palestinian liberation struggle. And so we know that Canada has an inherent interest in an imperialist interest in the Middle East. Like Canada is not going to do something against Israel out of its goodwill because they have an interest in resources, they have an interest in political control in the Middle East and including in Palestine, which is why they are so strongly allied with Israel. And so really we find that the key way to disrupt these types of imperialist systems, especially for us living under a capitalist system, is through material disruption, so disrupting the economy. And so one of the tactics that a lot of PYM chapters, both in the United States and in Europe and in Canada, have been taking up is actually direct actions that disrupt the economy, whether that's blocking highways in the morning when people are heading to work, whether that's doing sit-ins at certain businesses to prevent them from having business, whether that's shutting down major corporations that fund the Israeli army like Scotiabank. So like our Toronto chapter, for example, did a major sit-in at the Scotiabank headquarters where they shut down the Scotiabank headquarters. We've done a major sit-in here just last week actually at CATSI, which is a lobbying group that facilitates the arms trade between Israel and Canada and between a lot of arms corporations in Canada. And also every year we participate in No CANSEC. CANSEC is one of the biggest arms expos that happens every single year here in Ottawa. It's North America's biggest arms expo. And there's a bunch of arms corporations like Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli arms corporations that tests its weapons on Palestinians in Gaza and then sells them as field tested. Lockheed Martin, which is one of the biggest arms corporations, and a bunch of really immoral arms corporations, not that there are any moral arms corporations. And so we organize with several different groups within the International League of People's Struggle to do a blockade of that event every single year. And last year we were able to delay that event by like 2 hours, delay our minister, the Canadian foreign minister speaking at the event. And so we really believe in the power of the people. Like we also really, there's a strong benefit to also lobbying and speaking to MPs. But when you do that type of work, you draw the power from the power of the masses that are mobilizing for the cause. And so bringing together our people, whether it's through political education, however we can bring them into the cause, is a huge portion of building power in order to influence politics. And actually, we also organized one of the biggest marches in Ottawa, I'm pretty sure in Canada's history, for Palestine on, I can't remember the date. November 25th. Thank you, everyone who was there. Where we organized like buses from multiple cities across Canada to come into Ottawa to host this like huge mass protest. And we're protesting every week as well. So yeah, a little bit of the stuff that we take on.
And shout out to Sarah for her leadership in those protests. She keeps us going. I'll just add one little thing that Sarah made me remember, which is because she was speaking about disrupting essentially the economic support for Israeli apartheid and occupation and genocide. And so she mentioned the recent sit-in at CADSI. There was also IJV members, Labor for Palestine members, and POAM members who participated in a disruption at Export Development Canada, EDC, which folks, I'm seeing some nods. And so that is a government institution that facilitates trade between Canada and Israel, and the very preferential Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, or CIFTA. And so the purpose of that was to say, again, business as usual cannot continue with our tax dollars, especially, and basically to let them know that we see our government's concrete economic support, and this is what we mean when we say Canadian complicity in Israeli apartheid. And that was an important moment too, because not only were people disrupting that, but I think that it opened the conversation more broadly, right? A lot of people didn't realize or know as much about these concrete links, which we're learning a lot more now, right? In the media with all this information about the arms trade or military exports. And so supporting direct actions like that as well is something that we've been able to contribute to and work in coalition.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we also did we've been doing a lot, it's been a long 5 months, but we also did these sit-ins at MP offices, and then we also did another a picket line outside of Parliament, for example, to disrupt parliamentarians on Wednesday as they're going into the House of Commons. There was a recent disruption in Parliament. I'm not sure if folks saw the video, and then a lot of similar types of disruptive.
We should make a list of all of the achievements. I'm going to list.
Let me just add something very quick to that in terms of unions and the power of the union, especially if you take a BDS decision. Lots of unions, they have retirement plans, they have investments. You have to make sure there's many of the unions that might have their investments either directly in companies that are supporting the apartheid in Israel, or even sometimes directly with Israeli companies. So once a union takes a BDS decision, there's another step to take an action. Also, there are, for instance, tech companies like HP and Siemens that are operating, they're allowing the genocide machine of Israel to run. So when a union takes a BDS decision, they should go act and try to go see if their organization is working with a company that are doing something like that. So that's another thing that the BDS within union has probably the power to do, because it could lead to direct investment in funds.
Yeah, because a lot of universities also invest heavily in Israeli arms corporations or different Israeli corporations. And so a huge thing that we work on also is working with student organizations on campus as well. And we're actually working on a big campaign to try to get students to mobilize for their universities and their student unions to divest from Israeli products as well.
Excuse me, could I just add on that, just a question about, I know that the Apartheid Week is coming up, it's sort of like a whole month. So I don't know if the question's more towards Amnesty or the panelists, but are there activities planned for that? Will that be shared?
So the question was about activities for an Apartheid Week. I don't have anything from my side, but any of the panelists on that?
Because there's the annual event, right? The Israeli Apartheid Week, or it's usually the whole month of March.
Yeah, it's primarily, so the Israeli Apartheid Week is primarily student-led usually, and it's primarily done on campuses. But I'm actually not sure currently if any of the student orgs we work with are hosting anything. I'm sure there's a lot going on, but I think there would be.
And if you look at the main organization that's does a lot of the coordination of BDS, bdsmovement.net, if you follow them, they have actually just put out an announcement that they're calling on folks to organize Israeli Apartheid Week events, and I'm sure some of those will be online and folks will be able to join in remotely. So even if folks are overwhelmed because of the current situation, so even if we don't have anything in Ottawa, I'm sure there will be ways to plug into it. So I would follow pages like that to find more information.
So the next question, I'll take one from online, and it fits well with some of the questions we have listed from our volunteers as well. So could you speak to the ability of folks to draw the link between apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories and in Israel, as well as where apartheid is being practiced elsewhere? So the most clear example is historically in South Africa, but we also have accusations of apartheid in Myanmar, in China, and various other countries, as well as if the legal mechanisms around apartheid and crimes against humanity and so forth existed when Canada was first being formed, you could very clearly make a connection between our own treatment of Indigenous peoples historically and up into the current world that we inhabit. So to the panelists, I'm hoping you could speak to, as the question is phrased, being able to recognize the settler colonialist nation state approach of enacting apartheid, and how to educate, and maybe just to expand on the question to tie it into one here, but the importance of a global anti-apartheid sense of solidarity. So yes, apartheid in Israel, but also we're not going to lose focus of where that system of colonialism or settler violence is being enacted. So yeah, take it where you'd like, but to that question, we would love
start.
a response.
If you're seeing my screen right now.
Yeah, we can.
So I'm just going to start from here, and I'll draw the link with South Africa, and then we'll go from there. This is how Arab Palestinian land has shrunk from 1946, where Palestinians, had 93% of the land. The division decision, 1947, West Bank and Gaza, that was taken. We're left with these 248 islands. This is the Bantustan system of South Africa, which was the brainchild of some of the South African leaders, where they put the majority of the native population, native Black population, in these Bantustans, which are separate islands, and you need to have a permit to go there. Now, if you need to work in the farms that the Afrikaans had, you needed to get also a permit. That's the Bantustan system. Now, where did South Africa actually get the idea of the Bantustan system? First Nations reservation system created in this country and in the United States. Put, Native people in their own reservations, and then, you take the rest of the land. And they defended this. Now you keep hearing from the Israeli officials such as Benjamin Netanyahu saying, "Oh, we don't want Fatahstan or Hamasistan or there." So he's using the same terminology. Every let's say recent offer that was made about a two-state to the Palestinian people is just pretty much creating this. So in terms of giving people their own permits, exit permits to go, this was very clear with South Africa. South Africa operated on the supremacy of a certain ethnic group or race over the others, and this is the same thing that is happening here. We can draw links also with the civil rights movement in the southern state of the United States. We know how African Americans were not allowed to enter certain restaurants, certain areas. They had to go to the back of the bus. And with South Africa and here, the person in privilege is always argue, well, will be our end if we allow them equal rights. Who's coming from the position of supremacy? It's coming from a position of privilege, racist, ethnic privilege, will always make that claim. So the link is very clear. Nelson Mandela said, I believe in 1997, our liberation is not complete without the liberation of the Palestinian people. One more thing to draw is the Israel was friends with the apartheid system of South Africa. They held Peter Botha, who was, if you don't know that was the last apartheid prime minister, then president of South Africa. Israel helped South Africa of creating 6 nuclear bombs. When that system was dismantled and we see a society. I'd call him the leader of the free world right now, South Africa. The people who experienced the most from the apartheid were the ones who led that case in the International Court of Justice. Now, the same thing, you see it happening to the Rohingya in Myanmar and elsewhere, but here where you see actually the hypocrisy of the West. You see them, they don't practice what they preach. And I'd quote the High Commissioner of South Africa in an educational by Cape and Labour for Palestine on February 13th. It said, why do you consider Palestinians are members of a less race, or do you consider them not human? It's time for you to practice what you preach. Never there had been a state that acted in a sort of discrimination and genocide with impunity as Israel. Never had Israel had acted with such impunity, end quote, the High Commissioner of South Africa in Canada, February 13th, during the webinar organized by CAPE and Labour for Palestine. These are things that I come from my head. I'm going to let my colleagues to speak a little bit, but if you want any other things, I can. I can also tell you that Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist in 1985. Peter Botha came to speak, and the whole world expected him to release Nelson Mandela and do something, and he challenged the world and continued with everything. Very similar personality to Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm just gonna stop.
Yeah, we'll do a line. All right, we'll do a line. Okay. As usual, Sarah is keeping things moving in a good way. Like Allah spoke of, for me, when we think about the parallels, it's a direct line to Indigenous oppression and colonialism in Canada. We know that South Africans actually came and studied how does the reserve system work in Canada, as well as the pass system that, Indigenous people needed a permission from the Indian agent on their reserve in order to go visit family or go hunting or do any normal activities that a non-Indigenous person would be free to do. And I think we know that, South Africans also needed permission to leave and move freely. And we also saw, Allah's experience as well. So this is all dependent on a racial hierarchy, of course. And so this is another parallel, both in South Africa, in colonial Canada, and ongoing here, of course, and in Palestine today, where Israel is exerting its apartheid system. And it's a racial hierarchy. Not only we have a racial hierarchy everywhere in the world, right? Because white supremacy still exists, but in these situations, it is legally encoded. It's part of the whole system of the state. And so where we have the Indian Act in Canada, we have this different category, and the Canadian state gets to decide who is Indigenous and who isn't, who has that status, right? Indigenous people are considered, wards of the state. They're not considered full people. They do not have their own self-determination, right? Much like Palestinians and much like Black South Africans did in apartheid South Africa. And so essentially the denial of self-determination is the root of the struggle in all of these and in the other examples that the person who asked the question and Brandon mentioned. And so this is both important to talk about because it helps us understand the situation and how it's all connected to a larger system of colonialism and imperialism, and how we need to the capitalist system is ultimately based on inequality, right? There must be inequality, and in fact, it's racial inequality, either within a state or external to it, right? And so it's no surprise that Canada supports another colonial state like Israel. And until the people who lived in Canada and trade unionists and many people forced Canada to take a position against South African apartheid, it supported South Africa as well. We think of the 80s and 90s as the movement against South African apartheid, but that movement started in the 1950s, right? And so we can take lessons about understanding apartheid from these examples, but we can also take lessons about how to defeat it, right? And so that's why it's a very powerful analogy, at least in my understanding of the struggle. So I'll pass it to Sarah.
I think my comrades have spoken really well about the similarities between Israeli apartheid and other apartheid systems. So I'll actually answer the second portion of the question, which is the importance of global anti-apartheid solidarity. And I will actually like push it a little bit further to say like the importance of anti-colonial solidarity and solidarity of oppressed people across the globe, because this form of solidarity, like anti-imperialist solidarity, anti-colonial solidarity, has been going on for like centuries, I'm assuming. But like within the Palestinian context, it's been happening since the onset of the Palestinian national liberation struggle. So for example, like the Palestinian Liberation Organization had very deep ties with the Black Panther Party. They exchanged resources, they exchanged strategies. They had really deep ties and trained with Tamil Tigers, for example, as they were fighting oppression in their context as well. And so these connections between anti-imperialist struggles are actually critical to the movement against imperialism more broadly and to the movement against oppressive regimes more broadly, because we know that countries like Canada and the United States support other oppressive regimes, like they support Israel, they support Saudi Arabia, like they support all of these different forms of oppressive regimes. And actually Israel supplies weapons to oppressive regimes across the globe. I don't know off the top of my head, but like if you search it up, you will see several different, their ties to oppressive regimes is global. And so even within our organizing, like more recently than the PLO's context, like so Israeli police, for example, train US police and Canadian police, in fact. And so a lot of Canadian police chiefs have actually visited Israel to learn tactics and strategies as well. The knee on the neck maneuver that killed George Floyd was a maneuver learned from Israeli army by the American police. And so actually during the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and their uprisings, Palestinians in Palestine were giving advice to Black Lives Matter organizers about how to cover their faces effectively to avoid smoke bombs. Like they were exchanging different strategies. With the help of the internet, that's become a lot easier than in the times of the PLO. And so for us as the PYM, one of the core things that we organize through is the idea of joint struggle. And so we understand like that the usual terminology calls it solidarity, but we believe it's joint struggle because it's a struggle against the same oppressive system. Like whether it's with our Black brothers and sisters, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, we are fighting like against the same oppressive system that oppresses us and oppresses them. And so we work very closely with Indigenous, like we make an effort to work really, really closely with Indigenous allies across Turtle Island, with Black allies, including like the BLM type of org that exists here in Ottawa as well, with Filipino or activists, because US imperialism is very heavily oppressing within the Philippines as well, and with various different groups that are subject to imperialist aggression. And so that is like really a core part of our work that we believe is really, really important for us to continue to develop and build strategies, build the movement more broadly, and understand how our struggles are so interconnected as well.
Thank you so much.
Can I just add one little thing? Yeah, which, for those of us who are not directly impacted because we are white people, at the same time, this also, like the remarks that Sarah's just making about how global struggles are united, right? It doesn't actually benefit us either to be part of the oppressor group, right? And I know a lot of people are realizing that right now, especially in the past few months, right? And so that is also a whole other layer for folks like in organizations like IJV to help people come to and recognize that like our place is actually with all of these movements, because we wholeheartedly reject any of this being done because it doesn't actually benefit us or make us safer at all.
Great addition. Yeah, please.
So this might be a difficult question, but I'm wondering if the panel can tell us what decolonize and land back means to you in the context of Palestine, but also in the context of us being settlers in Canada, having maybe bought homes in this unceded land.
Excellent question. So just to come a little bit closer to the mic, is to the panelists' opinions about the literal, but also the use of words like land back, decolonization, And I appreciate the thought of how to reflect on that as folks who maybe want to live on unceded land like we do here in Ottawa, or purchase a home or something like that. And it ties in well with the question that I'll add, if that's all right. But if you could speak to the politics of language. So what framing is the most important? Even the use of word decolonization. Some organizations are using it, some are not. But I'll leave it to the panel to take that in the direction you wish. But great question.
Ready?
No.
Okay, do you want me to go? You can have a bit more time.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I can see my siblings here are like feverishly writing out their thoughts, so I'm gonna let them have a bit more time, and I'll just start with a brief response, which is essentially that what that looks like and what that means to me, decolonize and land back, is to take those terms and notions incredibly seriously and actually sit with them and hold them and say, what does this actually mean in a concrete way? Because what we're seeing in the past, I would say 20, 30 years is the use of these terms, or not just terms like this, but any term that is, for social justice by especially liberal people to claim that they are standing with these movements when in fact they continue to concretely benefit. And so I think we can connect it back to what we were saying about the actions that have been taken to dismantle Israeli apartheid and occupation. We need to look at what are the actual concrete, and I will say economic benefits that we benefit from as settlers, and how to recognize that in order to have land back and actual justice and self-determination for Indigenous people in Canada, but also in other places, we have to give those up. That is what that looks like, right? And so I'll give a very, very concrete example that maybe not everybody will relate to, depending on your type of employment. But, if I'm looking for work, right, and I see, a job is actually designated for an Indigenous candidate or an Inuit candidate, and, some people might say, oh, well, that's not fair. I want to, I'm just as good kind of thing. And being able to just be like, you know what, that's actually good. And I support that. And I have no problem with that, and educating other people about it. This is a very, very specific example, but essentially recognizing also that I, as a settler, I've done many great things in my life. I think I'm an accomplished person, but I would not have any of what I have if I had not benefited from the theft of land of Indigenous people and their genocide, right? So recognizing that it is not a meritocracy, and working to contribute to those struggles. And so that also means, like Sarah was mentioning, PYM has connections with Indigenous organizations, and that's why IJV also considers that we can't be fighting for justice in Palestine and that against that colonization without being very honest about the fact that we're benefiting from colonization here. So that's kind of what I would say to that. And I don't know which one of you is ready.
Okay, so when I take a look here, first, I feel ashamed of being a settler here because we're fighting settlers in our country. Land back means, yes, give land back. Give land back. Why is that so difficult? There are so much crown land in Canada. There's controlled and owned by the government of Canada. Well, it actually belongs to the native people. And we can just look at the Wet'suwet'en incident that happened a few years ago. And even of incidents with public parks that are here on native land. Yes, give it back. Absolutely. Doing a land acknowledgement just to make the settlers or white people feel good about themselves. What is that really doing? Do I want to wait 200 years when the Zionists annihilate the Palestinian people and we're down to 2-3%, and I have a land acknowledgement saying we are sitting here on the land of the Arab, Palestinian, Muslim, and Christian people here in Jerusalem who lived 200 years ago, but we annihilated and killed all of them. Do it. This land belongs to them. That's number one. Second, when you're talking about decolonization, I've been seeing that in sometimes training about anti-racism. I've seen it in our college. There is colonization language that has to go. Ideas of victim blaming and collective punishment, those are all connected to colonization. We can't start speaking we're speaking about truth and reconciliation here and decolonization, while Canada is supporting with strength a colonial state in the ethno-racial project called Israel. Now, if I want to move back to Palestine, and that'll guide me to another topic, which is what do you do now? And we always say the solution is a one-state solution. The Palestinians who were there, they still welcomed in the 20s the immigrants who actually went there. United Nations Resolution 194 of 1949 indicates that the Palestinian refugees, which you saw in that video, over 6 million, over 3.5 million outside, have the right to go back to their homeland. Palestinian refugees, such as, Sarah's parents and Sarah, should have the right to go back to where they came from in Palestine, not to be pushed to Gaza, not to be pushed to the West Bank. If they left Haifa, they should be able to go to Haifa. If they don't want, that's their own decision. No solution to the Palestinian problem, to the Palestinian cause, will work without the right of return for Palestinian refugees. How does it make sense if someone has no connection there? My colleague Claire just mentioned how she is able to go back to the land of Palestine and she can get an Israeli citizenship and she can serve in the army. I can't go freely. Sarah can never go. The solution for that, the first step is to just return the land, have one free state with equal rights for everyone, one free secular state with equal rights for everyone in the historic land of Palestine, whether those were Arab, Jewish, Muslim, Christians, Samari, Jews, whether they spoke Arabic, Hebrew, Ibrit, they should be able to live there. Only a privileged group with a racist view would reject that. So that's in summary what I say, the solution to return the land back to the Palestinian cause. And just to say something else, a few polls now, I can't recall that most Palestinian people are actually with the one-state solution, while most Israelis reject that. Why do they reject that? Because they will lose their point of privilege. The white people in South Africa, the Afrikaans really rejected the end of apartheid until there was mounting pressure there, and South Africa was being isolated. There are still voices in the southern state of the US long back to the time of segregation, because they felt they lost their privilege. Not that their things are right in the US. I lived there for 8 years and there's extreme segregation. I visited Georgia, South Carolina, and a few other states. So every refugee must have the right to come back. All that apartheid that we saw there must come down. The end of apartheid means the end of Zionism. One free state for everyone.
I think Hala covered that beautifully. Like, we as PYM believe in a free Palestine from the river to the sea, like unconditionally, and the full right of return for refugees, not only for my grandpa to go back to Safad, but to go back to his house that is still standing, that has Israeli settlers in it, in Safad as well. And I also think, like, just one point to add to that also is that a solution needs the full dismantlement of the existing oppressive systems, because we've seen, like, time and time again, and we see it right now in the United States, that the end of Jim Crow laws did not mean the end of segregation. It did not mean the end of discrimination. It meant that these systems still exist. It meant that Black people in the United States are still heavily in the biggest population in prison systems, where their labor is abused yet again, in a system similar to slavery that existed prior. So, like, the full dismantling of these systems is required for a lasting peace, because even in the South African example, I will say, like, there wasn't a full dismantling of the South African apartheid system, of like recreating a new system, and we see the consequences of that today. Like, Black people in South Africa see the consequences of that today as well. But yeah, I think my comrades covered that really beautifully, but I will speak to the politics of language. And one thing that I really want to emphasize is, like, I will say the human rights framework is a really important framework, but it has its limits, because human rights and international law is also limiting to us as Palestinians, when we know that the UN partition plan developed a two-state solution as like the all-to solution, and we don't believe in that. So we believe that we need to go beyond the human rights framework and international law frameworks for a decolonial framework, because Zionism, which is the ideology that essentially created the state of Israel as we know it today, is a colonial project. And early Zionists were very open about Zionism being a colonial project. They went to colonial powers like the UK, like France, like other different colonial powers in order to gain support for their own colonial project. And within language of early Zionist literature, there's very clear language about them wanting to develop a colonial project. And they obviously received immense help from the British mandate in Palestine as well, to form this colonial project. So the framework of the Palestinian struggle being an anti-colonial struggle, and not just one against like apartheid or not just one against racism, it's an anti-colonial struggle, is critical, because it really helps us understand the entire context beyond it being segregation of two people based on race. It's also a colonial project. And then also I would say, like, we see the importance of language very heavily in the media every single day, and especially like in Canadian and Western media. Like Palestinians killed by who? Palestinians dead. How did they die? It's like always the context is purposely removed from the media headlines in order to dehumanize Palestinians. And even like when they talk about Palestinian children, they don't call them children. They say like under the age of 18, Palestinian minors. Why not say children? Like these are children. There's a purposeful reason for that. And even the framing of our resistance. Like time and time again, we see any resistance against oppressive forces being framed as terrorism. And it's like, it's absurd, but it's also really important for us to be able to talk about resistance very openly and be able to talk about the right of Palestinian people to resist, including through armed resistance. People under colonization and occupation have a right to use armed resistance against their oppressors, and that is something that we should be pushing the barriers in order to ensure that all of us feel comfortable talking about it, because it is absolutely absurd that we shouldn't be able to talk about that, and there's a claim that Israel has a right to self-defense as the oppressor.
I just have to add, because what Sarah mentioned just remind me about Zionism is a colonialist movement from the beginning, and that is clear from the leaders. So what I have here in my hand, this is an article called "The Iron Wall." The Iron Wall was published by Vladimir Zaiv Jabotinsky, who is the father of revisionist Zionism. And this article was published in Rusvis in Russian in November 11th, 1923. And it was again published in 1937 at the Jewish Herald. Zaiv Jabotinsky, just a little bit, he's the father of revisionist Zionism. He had a big hand in creating Bitar, which was an extreme militant group that called for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, actually on both sides of the river. He was also one of the founders of the extreme Irgun militia that is responsible for the Deir Yassin massacre. So I'm going to read, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background and go a little bit. I don't want to take too much time, but the ideas of Zaiv, or his original name, Vladimir Jabotinsky, for revisionist Zionism, is actually, he was the mentor of Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin was the first prime minister of Israel from the Likud party, who led the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. This is the same party that is ruling Israel now, and this is where Benjamin Netanyahu is coming from. It is worth mentioning that Benjamin Netanyahu's father, Ben Zion Netanyahu, was the personal assistant for the secretary of Zaiv Jabotinsky. Zaiv Jabotinsky passed away at the age of 60 years old through a heart attack. I'm going to read a few things from the Iron Wall, and please just forgive me because there are some racist, extremely racist things that are said here and about the native population. This shows you where the similarity between the colonization here and there. Okay, now Zaiv Jabotinsky says there's no voluntary agreement between the new Zionists coming to the Arabs. Now, this is 101 years almost before now. I'm reading directly from the article, which is a bit of a manifesto for Zionism. There can be no voluntary agreement between ourselves and the Palestinian Arabs and the Palestine Arabs. Not now, not in the prospective future. I say that with such conviction. Not because I want to hurt moderate Zionists. I do not believe that they will be hurt, except for those who were born blind. They realized long ago it is utterly impossible to obtain the voluntary consent of the Palestinian Arabs for converting Palestine from an Arab country into a country with a Jewish majority. My readers have the general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest that they consider all precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there's one solitary instance of any colonization being carried out with the consent of the native population. There is no such precedent. The native population, civilized or civilized, have always stubbornly resisted colonials, irrespective of whether they are civilized or savage. So he's referring to the Palestinians. Zionism admits that Palestinians are the native people in Palestine. Now, again, there are some really racist terms coming out when he's speaking about what happened in North America. And to make it no difference whether the colonists behaved decently or not, the companions of Cortes, Pizarro, and other people will remind us our own ancestors under Yusha bin Nun behaved like brigades, the Pilgrim Fathers, for the first real pioneer. Listen to this, the first real pioneers of North America, where people are the highest morality, who did not want to harm anyone, at least, and forgive that term, I'm quoting directly, all the Red Indians. And they honestly believed that there was room in the prairies for the pale face and the red skin. Yet the native populations with the same furiosity fought against the good colonialists. Here's the colonialism language and the way he referred to the native people. So he's trying to take a script of how people colonized here. This is in 1923. Just want to pick up a couple of things of the racist language here. Yeah, just from another paragraph. The Palestinian Arabs are culturally 500 years behind us. They have neither our endurance nor our determination. The Palestinian Arabs, they feel at least the same instinctive jealous love of Palestine as the old Aztecs felt for ancient Mexico and the Sioux felt for the rolling prairies. And one other one, I can't read this whole article, you can look it up. Colonization can have one aim, and Palestine Arabs can't accept this aim. Therefore, we must go on beyond an iron wall. He means building an iron, forceful wall that, regardless of what the native population, the Arabs do, the Zionist movement will always be in place. This is one of the biggest manifestos of Zionism. You read that, you look at what Jabotinsky did. This is exactly what is being done right now. So I suggest, it gives just a good insight about that. It is available online.
Ray, did you mind if I add just one small thing?
Sure.
Yes.
Sure. So, and I guess because of my comrades' comments, thinking about decolonizing is also about recognizing how oppression functions, and that it's not just about I don't believe that decolonization is only about recognizing the rights of land back and Indigenous people, but also that oppression exists in a system on these lands. My comrades mentioned, the southern United States, but we can also be very real about the fact that in the northern United States and on these lands in Canada, anti-Blackness is a very deep, horrific system that also needs to be dismantled, right? And so recognizing the self-determination of Indigenous people, but also of everyone to have full dignity and rights doesn't happen in a colonial framework. It happens in a decolonial framework where liberation and self-determination is centered. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you so much. So time-wise, we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to ask a question that was online. We'll do one more here, and then I'll maybe wrap up and give folks a kind of concluding statements or what have you. So the question online, and I'll adjust it a little bit and add it to some of the questions that our volunteers wrote. But it's speaking to the South African experience. So we've seen that we can end apartheid. It existed for many decades and through many efforts from all over the world, and obviously in South Africa, it came to an end. So, and more than that, we now have the South African government, you could say, leading the charge with their case at the International Court of Justice and the efforts that they're doing to try and call for a ceasefire. So that's a real 180 there. Could you speak, the question asked, could you speak to the top one or top couple initiatives, efforts that you think would be the best to put our efforts in? And the question also asked how to convince those who are maybe unsure or on the fence that it is now in fact time to end apartheid in Israel and the occupied territories. So the key lesson from South Africa, where you would like to see folks put their effort, maybe both in Israel and Palestine, but also here in Canada.
Okay. First thing, in terms of like the similarity, we already covered that, so I'm not going to go through that. But in terms of the time, the suffering is continuing right now, and we have a genocide going in Gaza. There is almost 30,000 Palestinians who have been killed, 70,000 injured, or about 1.5 million are threatened with deportation, forceful deportation again, another Nakba, and there's immense suffering, there's famine, diseases, this is all a man-made disaster. That means that the Palestinian cause we need to act right now. We also have, unfortunately, it's because of what happened, but we have a little bit of a movement in the Palestinian cause, so we must seize the time. In terms of South Africa, there was a few things. There was, the African National Conference, and there was a united front from a few South African resistance and liberation movements from, the African National Conference, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and a few others. They were united in one front, so they were pushing from the inside. But South Africa would not have changed without the economic sanctions and the isolation. What happened in the 80s is South Africa started becoming isolated and started becoming costly for them. The sanctions worked, the isolation, and then at some point where the United States joined, I think the UK was later, but a few others who started a sanction that started by a people's movement and went there is what brought South Africa to its knees. The people of South Africa started in the 50s, but that wasn't enough. I think what we need to concentrate on is BDS, exposing Israel, and Israel must be isolated. They must be isolated economically, and they must be isolated politically. That's the only way that Israel would change its course. Israel right now is acting with such impunity that I have not seen any other nation pass the Second World War act with. They challenged the International Court of Justice laws, even any UN decision or Security Council decision, the rare ones that they challenge those too. And you know what? They are in a position of power. Economically and politically, Israel must be isolated by the free countries of this world. So we need to push our government hard to start sanctions on Israel, and also for other countries to cut their relations with Israel. Without that, it's a tough road ahead of us.
I think I'll just follow a bit on what my comrade Allah is saying, but maybe a bit more broadly. So apartheid came to an end because of the actions and choices, principled actions and choices of regular people, like everybody in this room, but also because regular people are part of larger structures in our society, right? We are employees, we are members of unions, some of us are students, some of us are part of neighborhoods or neighborhood associations. There's many structures in society that we're part of that we can use to join together in order to reject any complicity with Israeli apartheid. And Allah is talking about isolating Israel because the idea is we cannot have any business as usual with an apartheid state. And it must be very clear that this is a line that we will not cross, much like a picket line when workers are on strike. And so when we think about what's happening right now, we're seeing more and more people around the world and organizations that are rising to the occasion and pointing this out. So we see sports associations, soccer associations, specifically in the UK, taking a stand and saying no collaboration and no support for Israeli sports initiatives or anything like that, calling for Israel to be banned from FIFA and things like that. Cultural boycott and divestment is an incredibly important movement as well, and also very inspiring, right? Because, you know, this is one of the things that changes the world, right, is art and culture, as well as, you know, economic isolation and security isolation. Sarah mentioned the police trainings that happen and the collaboration from police departments. I know for a fact that the Toronto Police Department got training from Israel. And I'm sure that, you know, the Ottawa one has links as well in many other cities in Canada, right? So these kinds of things being called out and folks being educated about them so that people can take this stand. Whatever organization or group that you are part of, you as an individual can join up with other people in order to draw that line. One of the things that was done during South African apartheid was the creation of what are called apartheid-free zones, where, you know, and I believe there's actually a couple already established in Ireland right now, where no collaboration, no product, no association at all with Israel is permitted. And so, you know, we could do that in Ottawa, in a neighborhood or an area, right? So there's many possibilities.
Yeah, I think boycotting is an essential first step to the things that we should be doing right now. You know, like even outside of the brands that are on the BDS list, like be wary of when you're grocery shopping. There's products of Israel all over Costco, all over Loblaws, all over Farm Boy. And so, yeah, be wary of these things as well, but also join an organization. There are several organizations that are working not just again like for the liberation of Palestinian people, but also for broader liberation. So like even if against like oppressive structures in general. And so like whether it's Labor for Palestine, whether it's Independent Jewish Voices, whether there's orgs like the Anti-Imperialist Alliance, there's like several different orgs that folks can join in order to be part of the global movement against imperialism and the movement against Zionism. And that's critical. Like the more we grow our movement within those organizations, we find different strategies to apply pressure, find different strategies to disrupt the economy, find different strategies to push for the liberation of Palestine and push for people's liberation in general. It's critical. Like if you are able to and have time to, like please join an organization, or even like within your own workplace unions. You can join your workplace unions and influence the politics within your workplace unions to get your union to divest your pension plan, for example, like the Canadian pension plan, as was mentioned, to divest them from buying Israeli products or investing in Israeli corporations. Yeah, student unions as well, like various, like if you are employed and part of a union, organized within your union as well. I feel like I'm with the union people here, so I'm like advocating for y'all, but yeah, join a union.
I mean, you're also a union member, let's be real.
So given the time, we're gonna go into the concluding statements, but for folks who are here in person, there's no rush to run out the door. And so if the speakers have a few minutes, you know, have some fruit and a ginger ale or whatever's there and chat a little bit more. But I'm going to ask the speakers to just 1 or 2 minutes for what's the way forward and just your concluding statement, however you want to take it. It's totally up to you. But we'll do that and then a quick wrap up, and then we have a bit of time just to socialize in the room here. But over to the panelists, if you could, how to go forward and your concluding thoughts for the evening.
Okay, I'll start, I guess, for this one. I think that across the world, we're seeing like the movement for Palestinian liberation growing and the movement for against imperialism growing. And I think like this is a really critical moment for us. It's a devastating moment for our community, but it's also a moment where we're seeing mass mobilization and we're developing new strategies strategies and tactics in order for us to mobilize against oppressive systems. And so I am like hopeful for a way forward, and I do believe that Palestine like will be free one day. And I think like the way forward for that is for us to continue mobilizing and growing the movement. What was the other part of the question? I'm so sorry, I didn't write it down.
Just closing remarks.
Oh, and closing remarks.
What's important to you?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we'll see a ceasefire soon, and hopefully, you know, this is one of the most devastating moments in Palestinian history. Like we always refer to the 1948 Nakba as like being one of the most devastating moments for Palestinians, and we have surpassed the death toll and displacement toll that we saw in the Nakba today, and so this is like a huge loss for us as Palestinians, and it's also a really difficult moment. So I'm really hopeful that through growing our movement, we will continue to fight against Zionism in the ways that it exists everywhere, including in Ottawa. And also, I guess in closing remarks, don't be shy to talk about armed resistance and people's right to resist. I feel like it's a topic that people are shy to talk about. And like we know that armed resistance is a critical part of fighting oppressive systems. And so it's very important for us to normalize this discussion. So I'll close on that.
So I will just lead from what Sarah was saying. And I think so there's maybe a couple things I would want to close on. One is it's about continuing to speak up, right? And not like, hopefully we get a ceasefire as soon as possible, but this is the long game. This is a long struggle. It's not going to be over when a ceasefire is achieved, right? That is one basic step that honestly, I don't think anybody in this room can believe we are still asking for and still has not been implemented. So this is a longer struggle. And so it's about thinking, how are we going to commit to that in the longer term? And part of that is building our own courage when we do feel that fire in our belly that says we need to say something. There's massive amounts of repression right now. And so it takes, it is taking more courage. But when we educate ourselves and learn more, so for example, about the right of people living under occupation, their legal right to resist in the manner that they choose, using violence is one option, right? If we educate ourselves on this, then we are more confident to speak to it, right? And so somebody who has done a lot of work on sort of understanding the legal situation in Israel-Palestine is Nora Erekat, a really well-known legal scholar, Palestinian. And she explains very well that, Palestinians have the right to self-defense. Israel literally does not, right? So looking up information like that and really internalizing it so that you're able to explain it to others. And I also think because of the repression and people feeling afraid and the lack of courage to speak up, we need to support other people to speak up, right? So if you're somebody who's already speaking up, amazing. Just find one person who feels the same way but isn't feeling confident, and help them to build that confidence, because it is with all of us speaking up and saying this is unacceptable that is going to change things, right? Like was mentioned by my comrades, it's not by changing the minds of Zionists or racist Israelis or whoever that the liberation is going to come. It's going to come from all of us who believe in freedom. And I'm tempted to quote Ella Baker, who's an amazing civil rights activist, Black educator from the States, rest in power, who said, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." And so we need to take care of ourselves and rest when we can, but we also need to commit to this long-term struggle because the liberation of Palestinians is actually entwined with our own liberation, whatever identity we are.
I'll continue from that. I'll start by saying being silent is being an accomplice. There's no, it's black and white here. So if you can do something, you have to speak, whether that in social media, whether that at your work, whether somewhere else. Don't feel that you're alone. We have organizations here in Ottawa from, other than these three, we have, Labor for Palestine, the Palestinian Youth Movement, the Independent Jewish Voices. There is Amnesty International has volunteers. There's Ottawa for Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. There is so many organizations that you can actually join. There's also, unfortunately, there is a rise of anti-Palestinian racism. And anti-Palestinian racism is racism specifically against Palestinians or people who support Palestinians. There is a coordinated, organized campaign to muzzle mouths. whether that by us being harassed by police, by law, people being harassed at their work, media ignoring us, etc. None of that is random. There are organized campaigns for that. The work that we're doing right now should not end if this current horrific crisis, which is the worst since 1948, finishes. We should be looking 20, 30, 40 years in the future. Zionists have been working since 1896, and there's been working very actively since the First World War. I just read a few things from an article from Jabotinsky from 1923. We have a good chance here because right now, colonial powers and Zionists, they don't have just the control over the media that is there. They don't have the control over the narrative due to social media, due to other methods of communication. I think I ran across a poll that I'm not sure it was in the US or the West that 70% of young people were pro-Palestine because they do not subscribe to the regular media. They do not subscribe to CNN, Fox News, etc. They can get their news from TikTok, they can get it from Telegram, they can get it from something else. So if we start our work right now, we have a good chance. We should be able to change things. I see it in 10, 20, 30 years from now. But we have momentum with us, and we have to keep going. Also, if you have issues of suffering anti-Palestinian racism, Labor for Palestine has legal resources. Go to the website Labor for Palestine. We have a legal help service, and you can go online and send a message there, and we can help. So I'll just close by saying no occupation lasts forever. No apartheid lasts forever. The French occupation for Algeria lasted 2 years with over 10 million people, 10 million martyrs there, but it ended. This will end someday, and Palestine will be free.
So there's a note from one of our audience members here, which said in South Africa, the pronunciation that was used by Mandela and others for apartheid was apartheid. Apartheid. So I think tonight, it's been a wonderful expression of solidarity for all of us to be together in a learning environment, but also one that's pointing us in a direction where we can end this apartheid, we can end apartheid, hopefully sooner than later, hopefully in our lifetime. For those online and in person, I would encourage all to sign the Amnesty ceasefire petition, which has received more signatures than I think any other in honestly decades. We had over 1.7 million signatures in 15 days. So I'm sure it's well over 2 million, and we need to start with the ceasefire and build from there. And as a last thought, I would just want to say a huge thank you for our panelists who have been helping organize this for 2 months now. And I must say they gave us a lot to think about and a lot to hope for. So I'd just like to give them another round of applause. And